This episode is powered by Dialect Imports, taste the language of Italian terroir.
Yes, Diversitas was launched with the idea also to reflect as much as possible the Abruzzo identity of that tremendous biodiversity that we have. So obviously, all the unique animal species that we have in the Abruzzo region that are tied to that ecosystem, which render it so pristine, are depicted on the labels. And the name Diversitas, I think, is fairly implicit, is the diversity of
Okay.
the region. So Diversitas connects to the diversity of the region, which we see as richness, right? Which is at the base of the Italian, I think, grape varietal offering.
Fascinating people with stories to share, fabulous wines and the best local foods to accompany them, and beautiful places to discover and visit. All of this and more on Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on the Italian Wine Podcast. Join me for a new episode every Tuesday. Welcome to Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on Italian Wine Podcast. Today we travel to Abruzzo, more precisely to Loreto Aprutino, to meet my guest, Rodrigo Redmont of the Talamonti family wine estate, which he runs together with his wife Antonella. Buongiorno, Rodrigo. We met here earlier in the year, so I'm looking forward to an update of your activities. I know you've been traveling quite a lot lately. How are you today?
Hi, Mark. Thanks for asking. Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm just back from an extensive trip around the world that took me from Australia to Brazil to California and to Barbados, of all places. And always say I land here, and we are still in the middle of our harvest with a little bit of rainfall today, but otherwise a great harvest. So very, very intense moment for us right now, but obviously filled with a lot of joy and positivity.
Yeah, I was thinking that you've been traveling over this critical period, but I think you mentioned, Rodrigo, that the whites are harvested, Trebbiano Abruzzese, the Pecorino. The other whites are harvested quite early, where the red grapes, the Montepulciano in particular, is still to come. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. We generally start off with Pinot Grigio and Chardonnay, and then move on to the native varietals, which obviously would be Trebbiano, Pecorino, and Passerina. Then there's a pause because obviously the phenolic ripening of the grapes is very important, especially for the reds, especially for Montepulciano. And then that's when we work on the Cerasuolo, the wonderful rosé that we have in our region, and obviously the Montepulciano. And yeah, we will probably have at least another week, 10 days of harvest, obviously based upon the weather conditions that we are to expect.
Is that quite normal? Is this, I know the last few years have been, you suffered some incredible intense heat, you've had problems with mildew and many, many challenges. Is this more of a normal year, and is this looking really positive for this vintage?
I would say the harvest is finally one which is providing very good quality and decent quantity. As I mentioned to you earlier, the last two harvests, one has been 24 strongly influenced by drought, and obviously not only has that complicated things, with risk of obviously water stress, but especially with all the work that is necessary in the field. And the year before that, there was a tremendous amount of mildew, which was caused by obviously heat, obviously constant rainfall, not allowing us to enter inside the vineyards because the soil we have in Abruzzo, or at least in our region in particular, is a lot of sand and a lot of clay. And obviously with a little bit of rainfall, you basically pick up large chunks and obviously fall quite deep inside the mud. So it's very difficult to enter with a tractor. And so, yeah, the harvest has been, very, very promising. The whites, I have to say, we are very happy with the result. Very aromatic, very clean, very vertical. We've still in a phase where the individual plots have been vinified and are still kept separately before we do any blending of the single varietals from the different plots. And the rosé is more or less halfway, which for us obviously is actually a very important wine, both in terms of production, but also in terms of popularity in the Abruzzo region. Everybody drinks Cerasuolo here in Abruzzo.
Yeah, it's a beautiful wine and quite different from rosés produced anywhere else. Now, Rodrigo, when we met some months ago, you shared your story. But for those of our listeners who might have missed that episode, and it's episode 2183 on Italian Wine Podcast, I'm going to ask you to explain your background again. But first of all, I would like you to take us to Abruzzo. It's a region that people that visit Italy regularly may not have come to. It's a beautiful region. It's a region I've been to too infrequently, but the times I've spent there, I've really been astounded by the beauty of the mountains, the proximity of the sea. It's a very special land, and you're in Loreto Aprutino. So can you describe where you are, what the countryside is like, what the colors, the smells are at this exciting autumnal moment of the year for a winemaker?
Abruzzo is generally considered Italy's, best kept secret. It's one of those regions which is still extremely authentic. There has been really no influence by foreigners in terms of the purity of the culture and the food and the wine. And I think that's really what the interest for this region is. And, the reason for that is that we are surrounded by the Apennine Mountains that reach almost, I would say, 3,000 meters in height. Mind you, we've already had the first snowfalls up in the mountains where we can actually ski. And then we have one bordering part of the region's coast on the Adriatic Sea. So it's an area which historically has been isolated, and because of that, still maintains very much its authenticity, even though it's only 2 hours away from Rome. So you can literally come for a weekend to Rome and then obviously hop on a car or on a bus, better than the train these days because the infrastructure is not there, and come over for a more authentic and less over touristy region in Italy. The smells, the colors. We are in a moment where olive harvest is also underway. And so I would say that in the streets of the old town, we are smelling a lot of olive oil. This is, I would say, the most important smell which dominates the region. Loreto Aprutino is home to the first DOP classified olive oil of Italy. So obviously olive oil production is very important. And at the same time, we have harvested the whites and starting the reds. So obviously there's this very strong, almost pungent smell which surrounds some of the historical cellars and the wineries. Abruzzo is obviously strongly influenced by the four seasons, and so obviously you have foliage right now. So the beautiful foliage that maybe some people are accustomed to associating more with New England in the United States is something that you find very dominant in the Abruzzo region. So you have these shades of color that go from yellow to red. You have these cool, humid mornings that then sort of warm up during the course of the day. I think it's probably one of my favorite moments of the year.
Okay, Rodrigo, that's a really beautiful description of not only the region, the sites, but also the activity. I'm imagining right now in Loreto Aprutino, tractors trundling in, perhaps with the first of the red grapes coming in, but also the olives coming to the different olive oil mills that will be in town. And are we in full swing with the olives right now? It seems a little bit early to me compared to some other regions that I'm more familiar with.
It's funny you ask, Mark, but we're constantly battling with our vineyard workers who have olive trees to have them come and harvest the grapes because they're very concerned about their own olive trees.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So there's a
And
there's an arm wrestle literally between us and our team
yes,
on what to harvest. Will they do their olives or will we do our grapes? And it's very visceral as a because it's still very much a strong family affair. But yeah, you have to remember that the yields of olive oil in Loreto Aprutino are low. We're talking about 10%. The cultivar, which is the dritta, is a very thick seed. nocciolo, we say in Italian,
Yeah, yeah, the
and
pit.
very
Yeah.
little meat, and so obviously there's very little that is squeezed out. But it's a late Indian summer for us this year. And obviously, the environment has also changed because of the evolution of climate. And historically, with a lot of the commerce coming back and forth between different continents and Italy, many of the pests that would be transported in these containers would literally die over the course of the trip or as soon as they arrived here. Today, because of the warming of the region becomes more hospitable. And so there's also this challenge that everybody is faced with. So everybody's sort of in a rush and in a hurry to bring, the bountiful harvest to its final rest. Yeah.
And I'm imagining it's an exciting time of year as well when you're tasting that new oil for the first time. The new oil is much a moment of the year as the new wine.
Absolutely. This is a moment where, I'm sorry for our obviously animal rights people who may be a little bit contrary to this, but we still have a lot of hunting in Abruzzo. And so this is a moment where we also hear a lot of the dogs barking outdoors. This is a moment where we hear some gunshots being exploded. This is a moment where, the mushroom hunters and obviously the truffle hunters, we have white truffle, by the way, in Abruzzo, sort of a walking, down the streets and down the roads by the rivers. So it's a very, very exciting moment right now. And obviously it all blends in with this wonderful Montepulciano essence that we have in the air, which represents almost 75% of the production of the region.
Is that right? Montepulciano is 75%. That's really interesting. Well, Rodrigo, you shared the story of Talamonti, how you and your wife Antonella began this wine estate
Sure.
25 years ago. In our last episode, I'd like to have a bit of a recap of how you work, because I know you have 3 wine estates producing a range of wines. And also then we'll focus a little bit on the Diversitas project, which I think sounds extremely interesting. But just give us a bit of your background. Remind our listeners
Yeah.
of how this all happened.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a mutt, as you can tell. So my father's American, my mother is Portuguese. I was raised in Italy. I started in the wine industry after graduating from college in the United States, almost by mistake, I would say, or by chance. I was hired by Banfi in Montalcino. So I worked in Montalcino for several years. Credit to the Mariani family for really teaching me everything that I know in terms of wine marketing. It was a beautiful experience. And then moved on to the Marche region for another experience, always in the wine industry, but perhaps more connected to white wines. At which point I was approached and involved in this project at Talamonti that involved different partners, including the later to become wife that I have, Antonella. And initially, there were several partners, but it's always very difficult, especially in Italy, to work with different partners. So in a few years, we bought the different shares, and eventually it became a fully fledged family affair in 2007, 2008. And when we arrived in Loreto, the story, which everybody always laughs about, is that there are wineries in the region that date back to the 16th century. So when we arrived to Loreto and we wanted to buy land, everybody was not willing to sell their land, as obviously happens. And so we sort of had to purchase vineyards in 3 different parcels, at 3 different blocks, because that's what was available, especially with minimum size of maybe 15 hectares, which makes it more economically viable. So, we were the new kid on the block and we had to sort of prove our stripes, which we, eventually did. So the vineyards that we purchased are in different locations. One is surrounding the winery in Loreto Aprutino in the southern part. The second parcel is located in a frazione called Scannella, which is up towards the mountain in a cooler area, adjacent Torre dei Beati as a winery. And then we have a parcel of vineyards, which is located in Colle Corvino, which is the neighboring town, and it's closer to the seaside. And so from these vineyards, obviously, we source the different grapes, which then we utilize to produce the different estate bottled wines. And yeah, so Talamonti, Laria, and Colle Corvino, those are, shall we say, the 3 properties.
Okay, and you're cultivating both the native grapes, which would be the Trebbiano Abruzzese, the Pecorino, the Passarina for the whites, as well as, of course, Montepulciano. But you also grow some international grape varieties, is that right?
Yes, we found them on the vineyards. So we had two choices: either continue to nurture them, blend them into something else, or uproot them. And obviously, we chose to continue nurturing the vineyards and trying to produce the best quality wine from these international varietals, or mainstream, as I prefer to call them, because they really are Italian in the end, especially Pinot Grigio.
No, you're quite right. I guess non-native to Abruzzo we would
Correct.
say, yeah.
Correct. In fact, they carry the IGT classification and not the DOC classification because
Uh-huh.
of that.
Yeah. Now, Rodrigo, you mentioned earlier on that the importance, the incredible biodiversity of Abruzzo as a region, and in particular the area where you are, and also painted a vivid picture of a land of not solely monoculture, but many, many activities, the olives, I think there's a special slow food presidium
Yes,
bean, a white
bean.
bean, and I'm sure it's very much a mixed landscape, and this promotes the biodiversity of the area. That's very important to you and to your wines, isn't it? And it sort of lies at the heart of your project.
I think the idea of sustainability, the concept of sustainability, and the concept of biodiversity is right at the base of all the storytelling that we do for our region and obviously our wines. You're an area that has 80% of all the flora and fauna, or 70% of all the flora and fauna that exists in Europe. You're talking about 8,000 species between flora and fauna. So it's, quite a unique ecosystem. You have an area that has, all the influences of the sea, but also of the rugged mountain. And you also have a region that is extremely spread out. There are no metropolises here in Abruzzo. Maybe the largest towns might be 80, 100, maybe maximum 200,000 people. The majority of the hilltop towns are 3, 5, 7, 10,000 inhabitants. So this creates, I think, a region that has an incredible amount of biodiversity, not only on the flora and fauna style, but also on the cultural and human being side of it. There's a numerous amount of untapped traditions in the Abruzzo region, and I think it would be interesting if somebody would write more books about this theme for the Abruzzo region, because there really is an enormous amount of offering out there.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and maintaining traditional ways of life. I know it's one of the few regions in Europe where the transumanza still takes place. This annual movement of mainly sheep, isn't it, up in from the lower areas up to the high pastures in the mountains.
Yeah, it's the historical grazing of the sheep during the summer months, because obviously most of the sheep herdsmen, the shepherds, were located in Puglia and the coastal regions of Abruzzo. And obviously during the summer, for the fresh grass, they would bring them up to the mountains to eat the grass, and then eventually shear also their wool before bringing them back down. That was part of the whole journey, if you want, that was made. And actually, that's one of the reasons why the grape variety Pecorino carries that name, because obviously the sheep would, make graze their way through the vineyard rows and would nibble on this grape variety, which is very sweet. And the old farmers obviously nicknamed it the sheep's grape. So Pecorino, thus Pecorino.
That's really interesting, and that this tradition of the movement, I think it's of millions of animals, still takes place. And the shepherds would be milking their sheep and making the pecorino cheese up in the mountains. Is that where the best pecorino comes from?
I would say, the cleaner the air and the purer the grass makes, obviously and the more relaxed environment and quiet environment, obviously creates that environment which produces the best cheese.
I guess those cheeses then get transported down from the mountains to the market to be sold. Are you able to find those summer mountain cheeses? Well, I mean, they would be aged, and then you would be able to be finding them and enjoying them.
There's the extremely famous Gregoriano cheese, which is, considered, like the legendary cheese artisan of Abruzzo. And then you have areas like Farindola, or you have Castel del Monte, which is obviously about 40-45 minutes from where we are that are, areas that are extremely well known for their sheep cheeses. And not only that, because obviously that saffron is also grown in the mountains of Abruzzo, especially in the Navelli region.
Ah, yes, of course. And cheese, of course, is the Pecorino cheeses of Abruzzo are great partners to your wines. Now, Rodrigo, last time we mainly focused on the wines of Talamonti. I'd like to, though, focus today perhaps on wines from your Colle Corvino estate, and in particular on the Diversitas range, which is a different project. Tell us a little bit about Diversitas, about the Colle Corvino estate and the wines you're producing there. Just give us a little bit of this story.
Yeah, so a 30-hectare contiguous estate where we have some mainstream varietals aside from the native ones. It's one of the last properties that we acquired and that we have been diligently working in a sustainable fashion. The vineyard is about 8 kilometers from the winery itself, fairly flat road to get to the winery. And, the thought when we started making wine in Loreto Aprutino, we really had two directions that we could undertake. It was either making the legendary wines, our vineyards are adjacent to Valentini, or try to make legendary wines, which seems more appropriate, or try to express something which really is more at the core of the Abruzzo identity, which is, authenticity and also very strong over delivering in value. And we thought about it for a very long time. And for us, what was important was the philosophy of eating and drinking in the Abruzzo region. That's really what we were looking for. And we felt that our wines should reflect the place and the identity of the area as much as possible. So we chose, obviously, to produce, premium wines, but at a more affordable price point. And the reason for that is, I think one of the curses of our industry has been that everybody has tried excessively to premiumize their wines because this is the direction where the consumer is going, but forgetting that by doing that you're actually eliminating or cutting any new customer, a new person who wants to try wine for the first time, and the true base of the consumption of wine, which is the everyday wine that everybody can enjoy. And so I think there needs to be a little bit of return of the customer at the center of this whole process. And we have to remember really, what wine is. Wine is a very important lubricant socially. It's a very important moment of socializing with family and friends. It's, multiple generations being together. And just because, wine does not have legendary status, it doesn't mean that it's not a very high quality wine. So I think there has to be a little bit of a return to that.
Actually, Rodrigo, I think that is a really important and fundamental point. And Abruzzo does have this dichotomy between, as you say, the greatest wines from Abruzzo rank alongside the greatest wines of Italy and indeed the world in terms of stature and price. But one of the features I think that attracts people to the wines of Abruzzo is their drinkability, their ability to pair beautifully with food and to be available at more accessible prices. So I can see why you were having this discussion and the way you went. So the Diversitas range is very much made with this in mind, made with drinkability at the forefront and pairing with foods. Is that right?
Yes. Diversitas was launched with the idea also to reflect as much as possible the Abruzzo identity of that tremendous biodiversity that we have. So obviously all the unique animal species that we have in the Abruzzo region that are tied to that ecosystem, which render it so pristine, are depicted on the labels. And the name Diversitas, I think, is fairly implicit, is the diversity of the region. So Diversitas connects to the diversity of the region, which we see as richness, right? Which is at the base of the Italian, I think, grape varietal offering.
Talk us through, say, 3 or 4 of the wines within this range. Just give us an idea of what you have in this range.
Yeah. So, for example, we have, wonderful Pecorino L'Orso, which in Italian means bear, where there's a bear head depicted. It's a pecorino which obviously does stainless steel fermentation with a touch of skin maceration at a cold temperature, and which, develops this density and minerality, which I think is today very, very sought after. People are drinking more Albarino, Sauvignon Blanc, more Viognier, and I think, Pecorino fits in that sort of category, and it is really the grape variety which put Abruzzo on a quality map over the last 20 years. A lot of farmers accustomed to producing more Trebbiano uprooted the Pecorino grape. It's a little bit of a lost grape variety. And so I think it's a very important wine for the region and for ourselves. And that's why we have placed the bear, which is, the symbol of Abruzzo. We still have brown bear in our region.
Okay.
So this is obviously very, very important to us. We also have the Passerina, which I'm actually very passionate about, because I think Passerina today is predominantly present in the Marche region, but Abruzzo has also, shall we say, a vested interest in this grape variety. And I think there isn't that much variety of Passerina. And so we see it as an opportunity really to show the versatility of Abruzzo wines and also to extend the range. And, Passerina is produced with a butterfly in the region, in the label itself. And the reason for that is that obviously butterflies are an indication of a pristine environment and are very important for pollinating across the region. So they have this double role and function, if you want, with the environment. And then I would say, obviously, most important, Montepulciano grape, but for the Cirasuolo, because we have a fox, which obviously there are plenty of fox here in the Abruzzo region depicted on the label. But, I really want to emphasize a little bit the popularity of Cirasuolo. On one side in Abruzzo, everybody is, drinking Cirasuolo. It's got this very dark cherry-like color and is very versatile, can be paired to a myriad of different dishes, whether it be, spicy Thai or curries from India, or more traditional dishes like arrosticini here in our area. But Cirasuolo, I think, is also very interesting. I've come back from a 6-week trip, and as I was telling you earlier, on to Australia, California, Brazil, and Barbados. And there's this sort of trend and growth for chilled red wines. And I think it's a category which is opening up some opportunities in different wine lists. With the climate that is changing, that people are looking to drink these more thirst-quenching, high-acid reds at a colder temperature. And this would open up, obviously, the category to more consumers. And so, Cirasuolo has a beautiful story also. That historically the red grapes of Abruzzo were planted up in the mountains, and earlier on, several decades ago, it would snow much more frequently early in the season, September, October. And so the farmers would have to harvest the grapes, sometimes not even fully ripe, and they would have to do something with it. And so they would do very quick, soft macerations in order not to extract the harsher, greener tannins. And that's how Cirasuolo was born. And so it's a very important wine for our region, because it's one of the oldest rosés of Italy, and certainly one of the reference points.
And also quite at odds with this trend for the Provençal style paler rosés. It's, as you say, it's a rosato with really full color, beautiful wine, a rosato unlike any other rosato, and I think one of the finest from Italy, but in that different style. And I'm interested to hear of that versatility with food. We'll move on to food in just a bit, but I'm assuming, Rodrigo, you're going to now tell us about your Montepulciano in the Diversitas range. Is that right?
Yes, the Montepulciano, which is a grape variety that has generally color intensity and obviously good, tannins, which are always the challenge in Montepulciano, because the seeds tend to be larger in the Montepulciano grape, and that obviously puts an issue in the structure of the wine and the elegance of the wine. So the harvest date is very important. That's why we are still continuing to wait, and that's why we utilize a little bit of microoxygenation from the barrels, but also in the vats, in order to be able to produce this wine. And I think that the Montepulciano in the Diversitas range is a wine that has very nice fruit, a touch of spice, and also is extremely versatile, whether it be, again, arrosticini, or, we have for example, Thanksgiving coming up in the United States shortly. So obviously with turkey or roast turkey, or with more flavorful cuts of meats in barbecue, like sausages or hamburgers, or classic Italian food. Everybody's always afraid to recommend red wine with pizza because they see pizza as a negative, maybe more entry level food pairing. But I wish people would recommend pizza more often, as it's one of the top selling foods of Italy, and it would make sense to sort of do some sort of partnership. So meat ragouts, whether it be timballo, which is like an Italian lasagna, if you want, an Abruzzo lasagna, very good pairing. These different dishes that we have in Abruzzo and outside of the Abruzzo pair beautifully.
Yeah, that sounds really good. We spoke about some of the traditional foods of Abruzzo last time, Rodrigo. You talked about brodetto from the Adriatic coast and how that pairs so well, I think, with the pecorino, and the arrosticini, these cubes of succulent lamb threaded onto long skewers and cooked over wood or charcoal. Such a classic taste of Abruzzo, pairing so well with the Montepulciano, whether Cerasuolo or the Montepulciano d'Abruzzo Reds. Rodrigo, you've just mentioned Thanksgiving. I'd like to maybe ask you to pair the wines you've just mentioned with some of the foods in, say, America or elsewhere in the world that you think are particularly good matches. You've just come back from 6 weeks of traveling all around the world, so I'm sure you've been enjoying your wines, your own wines, and I'm sure that's been always fun with different foods.
Yeah, I mean, it was, almost winter season or fall season in many of the countries where I went. So cool for them, even though not necessarily for ourselves. Generally speaking, I was more impressed more than anything with the food scene in Melbourne, which I had not really known. There's a lot of Italian immigrants in Australia, and a lot of them coming from obviously the Abruzzo region. And one of the pairings I found actually most interesting was a Mediterranean Middle Eastern restaurant. So, whether it be Turkish kuftes, which are like small hamburgers, or whether it be hummus, or whether it be, lamb with a little bit of spice, these are, dishes that will pair wonderfully with the Cirasuolo or with some of the reds that we produce. So that would be, obviously one food scene that I think would be very, very interesting. In Brazil, obviously, there is, the famous rodizio, which is, extremely popular, where they, you're at a restaurant where they're bringing all sorts of roast meats. It goes from, chicken hearts all the way to, finger licking picanha cuts and sausages. And so obviously Montepulciano definitely would be, the most interesting pairing. But, I think the Diversitas Volpe, also with that acidity that cleansed the palate, would also pair very nicely. In California, obviously, seafood. So, any kind of raw seafood today, very popular, sushi, sashimi, any kind of raw fish, whether it be oysters, for example, would pair beautifully with, either il polpo pinot grigio from Abruzzo or the orso pecorino, which is very, very aromatic. It was, a trip of great contrast, which then eventually brought me to Barbados for the first time. I had never been to Barbados, and it's a fairly large island for the Caribbean, and a lot of sort of Creole, if you want, Asian dishes aside from seafood. A lot of very good mahi mahi, which I think would pair beautifully with la farfalla passerina from Diversitas. So I would say that what is interesting is that these wines have this great versatility because of the on the whites, the salinity, the acidity, the freshness, and the aromatic side of it. But then also, I think the Cirasuolo really adapts very, very easily and follows this trend of these chilled reds, which are becoming more and more popular, I think, in general in the world.
Actually, that's a very interesting point about the chilled reds. I think you're right. That is an important trend, and beautiful wines too. That's a fascinating world tour in a nutshell there, Rodrigo. Thanks for sharing that. You've said that Abruzzo is one of Italy's, perhaps one of Europe's best kept secrets. I'm sure you've made our listeners want to visit Abruzzo, want to learn more, want to see this biodiverse land of mountain and sea. Can our listeners visit you in Loreto Aprutino?
Oh, they absolutely can. We are finishing the renovation of the winery. We've just brought in the terracotta amphoras. We've also just brought in the cement tulips and some new barrels. And so we're currently restructuring part of the cellar and also the hospitality area, where I think we'll be able to host some, a lot of fun thematic events, not just tour and tasting, but, we're looking to do cooking lessons and book clubs and, foreigners in Abruzzo gatherings. We want to make this as interactive as we can, more of a frame, if you want, or a landscape where people can interact. It's, at the foot of the Gran Sasso, you have the Maiella mountain range, which also is almost 3,000 meters, away. It's in a beautiful agricultural area where you don't have any noise. I went to sleep last night after I had been traveling, and the thing that struck me, regardless of the fact that I had been in so many different places, was the quietness in the evening. There was no sound, and it was a very soothing, if you want, feeling, to be back at home in a very quiet environment. And I think that's always what has attracted me to the Abruzzo, even though we have a very busy life with a lot of travel and entertaining. Abruzzo is very soothing, so if you're looking to find yourself, reconnect with yourself, I think Abruzzo is the right place, whether it be up in the mountains, like the different religious hermits used to do, or whether it be in the middle of the countryside. Abruzzo is one of the least densely populated regions of Italy. So, there's not a lot of people. There's no industry. Or you can go to some of the national parks, which are at the seaside. And, if you like to listen to the sea and the sound of the waves, there's plenty of spaces like that. So I think there's everything for anyone sort of in Abruzzo. And they're very, they love children. They are extremely generous and warm. It's super safe. And again, it's 2 hours away from Rome. It's a hop and a skip, from Rome. So next time you plan a trip to Rome, any of the listeners, think about renting a car or taking a bus to Abruzzo. I guarantee you'll be happy about it.
Well, that's a great invitation to all our listeners. It certainly makes me want to jump on a plane and visit Abruzzo.
Well, I'll be there next week if you want, Mark.
Okay. Well, Rodrigo, thank you so much. It's been great catching up with you, chatting to you again, hearing about new developments, about your travels. I hope the remaining weeks, as you wait to get those precious Montepulciano grapes safely in the cellar, I hope the weather is kind to you, and I'll look forward to hearing an update sometime soon. But in the meantime, thanks so much for being our guest today. It's been a real pleasure.
Grazie, Mark. My pleasure. Thank you for listening to me.
We hope today's episode of Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on the Italian Wine Podcast has transported you to somewhere special. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your pods. Likewise, you can visit us at italianwinepodcast.com. Until next time, chin chin.
This episode is powered by Dialect Imports. You can find all the wine of this winery in their portfolio.